Oregon, 1923. The valley is dying. 7 weeks without rain, and the land has gone the color of old bone. Cracked pastures, empty creek beds, cattle sold off in silence. From the ridge, you can see it all. Miles of failed earth stretching west toward the mountains. But in the lowest corner of the valley, something is wrong. One patch of ground is still green. Move closer. 10 acres of marshy soil sitting at the bottom of a natural bowl where the water collects and stays. A tilted shed, a basin full to the brim, and a flock of geese, nearly 200 of them, working the wet grass with the unhurried certainty of creatures who do not know what drought means. A young woman stands at the fence watching them. She has $83. She has a deed that the whole town laughed at. And somewhere down that dry valley road, a man in expensive boots has just stepped off his horse. He is not here to offer help. The driver did not slow down. He cranked the lever on the back of his freight wagon, and 350 goose eggs cascaded out of the cargo gate in a soft, terrible avalanche and hit the ditch at the side of the road in a sound that Willa Mercer would spend years failing to describe to anyone who asked. Not a crash, not a break, more like 350 small private disasters happening at the same moment, each one its own quiet ending. Willa stood 10 feet away and watched every single one of them hit the mud. The driver climbed down from his seat without hurry. He was a thick-shouldered man she did not recognize, and he looked at her the way a man looks at someone who has arrived at a scene they do not need explained. Rejected lot, he said. Buyer in Millhaven would not take cracked shells. Whole shipment was compromised in transport. They go bad. The smell contaminates everything in the storage room. He wiped his palms on his thighs. You want them, they are yours. Otherwise, they rot by morning. He climbed back onto the wagon seat and clicked his tongue at the horses and left. And Willa stood there alone in the dirt road with 350 broken eggs and a silence that felt like it had weight. She did not move right away. She crouched down beside the ditch and picked up the nearest egg. The crack ran from the air cell end down about a third of the length of the shell. A hairline fracture, not a break. She pressed her thumb gently along the edge of it and felt the membrane underneath, intact and warm. She could feel faintly, almost imperceptibly, the heat of a living thing that had not yet stopped. She checked 4 more. Out of 5, 4 had unbroken membranes. She held one up to the afternoon light and looked at it for a long moment. Then she sat down in the dirt road. She sat there for a full 5 minutes, which was not something she did. She was not by nature a person who sat down in the middle of roads and stared at nothing. But she was doing it now because she was trying to be honest with herself about something important. What she was considering was not reasonable. It was the kind of idea that would cause every sensible person in Caldwell Flats to press their lips together and say nothing, because they would not want to be unkind. But the eggs were warm, and her marsh was empty, and she had 4 geese on her land who had already proven to her that wet ground was not the same thing as bad ground. She stood up. She walked back to the sink and got her bucket. To understand why that decision mattered, you need to understand the woman who made it. And to understand the woman, you need to understand what she had walked into 4 weeks earlier and what she had chosen to do with it. Willa Mercer arrived in Caldwell Flats, Oregon in the second week of April 1923 with $83 in a leather pouch, a canvas bag with 2 changes of clothes, and a deed to 10 acres of land that nobody wanted. She had traveled 4 days by rail from Portland and another half day by hired cart. She was 26 years old. She had no plan that any reasonable person would have called a plan. She had instead a stubbornness that her mother had always described as her worst quality, and her father, God rest him, had always called her greatest one. The land had come from her uncle, left in his will without explanation or apology. The attorney in Caldwell Flats who handed her the deed was a careful man who chose his words with the precision of someone navigating around something unpleasant. He called the property an agricultural parcel, Eastern Quadrant, Caldwell Township. He did not say what the locals called it. She heard that part through the wall. The attorney's office was old, and the walls were thin, and the 2 men talking in the hallway did not know she was on the other side. Old Mercer's niece got the sink. One of them said, "Lord, that is not an inheritance. That is an apology." The other man laughed. Willa stood very still on the other side of that wall and breathed slowly through her nose until the burning behind her eyes went away. Then she signed the papers and walked out into the afternoon sun and told herself she was not going to cry in the street. She did not. She saved that for later alone, sitting on the rotted front step of the small structure on the sink that the deed called a dwelling, and that Willa privately called a very ambitious shed. The roof had two places where daylight came through. One of the windows had been boarded over from the inside. The floor was solid enough, but sloped noticeably toward the back wall, and when she set her leather pouch down, it slowly slid 3 feet before stopping against a crack in the baseboard. She watched it slide. She picked it up. She set it down again. It slid again. Willa laughed, not a happy laugh, the kind of laugh that comes out when the alternative is something worse. She pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth and breathed and looked out over her 10 acres of wet, unloved, unwanted ground, where cattails grew thick along the waterline and red-winged blackbirds sat in the reeds calling to each other in voices that sounded honestly like small arguments. "All right," she said to nobody. "All right then." She unpacked her bag. She found a bucket and cleared the worst of the debris from the floor. She spent her first night in Caldwell Flats sleeping on top of her canvas bag because the bed frame was missing 2 legs. And in the morning she got up and went to introduce herself to the town. Caldwell Flats was not a cruel place. It was a practical one. The people who had built their lives there, ranchers and feed merchants and a blacksmith and the woman who ran the post office and seemed to know everything about everyone, had done so by making sound decisions about hard land. They respected soil that yielded. They respected people who knew what they were doing. They did not know what to make of Willa Mercer. She was too quiet to be a schemer and too serious to be a fool. But she had taken the sink, and that said something about her judgment that nothing else she did could quite walk back. Her first stop was the feed store. The owner was a wide man named Merritt Coble, perhaps 50, with the careful posture of someone who has spent a long time being the person other people come to with their problems. He listened to her questions about soil amendments for marshy ground with the neutral expression of someone trying not to be discouraging. He explained about lime, about the acidity of wet ground, about how the drainage on the sink meant roots could not hold. He was not unkind, he was thorough. He used the word unfortunately more than once. Willa asked him what grew there naturally. He thought about it. "Sedge grass," he said. "Read some watergrass along the edges. It is not nothing. It is just not farming land." "No," Willa agreed. "It is not." She bought what she could afford. Lime, a small amount of seed, some basic tools. She carried everything back to the sink herself because she could not afford to hire the cart twice. When she set her bags down inside the shed that evening, she turned to find her leather pouch had slid to the far wall again. She picked it up and sat down on the floor with her back against the wall and looked at what she had. $81 now. A tilted shed. 10 acres of ground that a feed store owner had described with the careful gentleness of a man informing someone that their situation is hopeless. She was about to pick up her notebook when she heard voices outside. 2 men on horseback passing on the road that ran along the south edge of her land. She recognized neither of them, but the taller one, broad-shouldered and sitting his horse with the ease of someone accustomed to owning the ground beneath him, slowed as he passed and looked out at her property with the evaluating eye of a man who has priced everything he has ever seen. She heard him say her name. She heard him say the word sink. She heard the other man laugh, and then she heard the tall man say, in a voice calibrated to carry exactly as far as it did, that he would give her until June. She stood up and went to the window. The tall man had not looked back. He was already continuing down the road, easy in his saddle, certain of his assessment. She did not know his name yet, but she memorized the set of his shoulders and the color of his horse and the way he sat, and she wrote in her notebook, "Man on gray horse, road, south boundary. Estimates I fail before June. Useful information." She had learned early in life that people who predict your failure are not your enemies. They are your calendar. She found out his name the following week. Prentice Thatch, owner of the largest cattle operation in the western part of the valley, a man the locals spoke of with the combination of respect and wariness that accumulates around someone who has been right about too many things for too long. He had 300 head, good land, and the settled confidence of a man who has never needed to revise his opinion of anyone. Willa filed this away and went back to work. It was 3 weeks after her arrival that she met Halvard Baki. He appeared one morning at the edge of her property line, standing perfectly still in the sedge grass, with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the marsh. He was a short, broad man in his early 70s, with a white beard that grew unevenly and eyes that were pale blue and alert in a way that made him look perpetually on the verge of noticing something. He had been there long enough that the red-winged blackbirds had stopped paying attention to him. Willa watched him watching the marsh for 2 full minutes before she walked over. "Can I help you?" she said. He did not startle. He had heard her coming. "You are the Mercer woman," he said. His accent was thick Northern European, Norwegian, she would later learn, worn smooth at the edges by 22 years in Oregon. "That is right," she said. He looked at her, then back at the marsh. "I am Bake. 40 acres to the north. 22 years here." He paused. "I wanted to see who had moved into the sink, and now I have seen." He was quiet for a moment, studying the waterline with an expression that was not idle. "You have good sedge grass here," he said. "Very healthy. I have been told the land is worthless." Halvard did not turn around. "The land is what it is," he said. "Worthless is what people call things they do not understand how to use." He said it the way a person states a fact they have held for a long time and are tired of having to repeat, not with bitterness, with a particular flatness of certainty. He told her to come see his geese. She followed him through the fence line and across his property to the northern edge, where 60 large gray birds were working the wet ground with the blunt, busy authority of creatures exactly where they were supposed to be. They cropped the water grass flat. They stirred up insects from the soft soil. They moved through the low, wet areas without complaint, without effort, with the ease of animals whose bodies had been built precisely for this kind of ground. Halvard explained what they did for the land in the same calm, specific way he explained everything, watching his flock with an expression that was not quite pride but was close to it. They had started with 4 birds 22 years ago, 60 now. Willa looked at her 10 acres of wet ground and healthy sedge grass. She was doing the mathematics that you do when you cannot afford to be wrong. She bought 4 breeding geese from Halvard the next morning, spending money she could barely afford and doing it anyway. She set them loose on the sink and watched what happened. What happened was they immediately began eating the sedge grass and acting like they owned the place. Because they did, she was beginning to understand something. She could feel the shape of it the way you feel the shape of a room in the dark before your eyes adjust. She was not ready to say it out loud. She was not ready to say it even to herself. But the shape was there, and then came the wagon and the eggs and the decision in the dirt road. It took her 4 trips and most of the afternoon to carry all 350 eggs back to the sink. She used her apron and her bucket and her canvas bag with her clothes removed and stuffed under her arm. She was careful. She was methodical. She was also at one point passed on the road by 2 men from town who slowed their horses and looked at her with expressions she chose not to interpret. One of them said something she could not quite hear. The other one laughed. She kept walking. By the time she got the last of the eggs to the shed, laid carefully in the hay she had spread in the back corner and wrapped in the only spare blanket she owned, it was evening and she was exhausted and she had not eaten since morning. She sat on the floor next to 350 cracked goose eggs and ate the last of the biscuits she had made 3 days earlier and thought, "This is either the beginning of something or the end of me." Then she went and got Halvard Baki. He came in the early dark, carrying a lantern and a wooden box she did not recognize. He set the lantern down and crouched over the eggs for a long time without saying anything. He turned several of them, held 2 up to the lantern light, ran his thumb along a crack. "Most of them have intact membranes," Willa said. "Some do," he agreed. "Some do not." She asked him about sealing the cracked ones. She had read about using beeswax on hairline fractures, applied thinly enough to seal the shell without blocking the exchange of air the embryo needed to survive. She had written to a poultry keeper in Pennsylvania named Reed Klein 3 weeks earlier when she had first begun thinking about whether the marsh could support a larger flock. Halvard looked at her then, fully for the first time. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but a recognition, the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he had already figured out. "You wrote that letter 3 weeks ago," he said, "before these eggs existed. I write a lot of letters about geese," she said, "about a lot of things." He reached into the wooden box he had brought and set a small tin on the floor between them. "I have beeswax," he said. Willa looked at the tin. "You knew," she said. "I knew you were thinking," he said. "I did not know about what. But I brought things that might be useful." He reached back into the box, warm sand for insulation, a thermometer, and beneath those, folded neatly, several extra wool blankets. He set each item on the floor with the deliberate care of someone who had thought through this before he came. "Temperature is everything," he said. "You must keep it consistent through the night. Too cold and the embryos go dormant. Too warm and they die." "I will sleep in here," Willa said, "with them. I can manage the temperature through the night if I stay." Halvard was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded once and reached back into the box. I also brought these blankets for a person, he said. I thought you might say that. They worked through the night together, checking membranes by lantern light and sealing hairline cracks with thin, careful applications of beeswax, setting the viable eggs in warm sand, pulling the bad ones aside without sentiment. Halvard showed her how to hold each egg up to the light to read the membrane, how to apply the wax in a single smooth pass without pressing, how to arrange the eggs in the sand so the warmth would distribute evenly. He explained each step once, clearly, and she did not ask him to repeat any of it. By the time the first gray light started coming through the patched holes in the roof, they had sorted through all 350 eggs. Halvard wrote the number in a small notebook he had brought. He looked at it for a moment, then turned it so she could read it. 218. Willa looked at that number. She thought about the freight driver's face. She thought about the buyer in Millhaven who had looked at those eggs and seen only the cracks, only the surface, only the thing that made them inconvenient. She thought about the men on the road who had laughed. She thought about Prentice Thatch on his gray horse giving her until June. She put her hand flat against the warm sand and felt the faint, insistent heat of 218 eggs that had been declared worthless and were not. 3 times a day, she said. 3 times a day, Halvard agreed. Starting now. He was already reaching for the thermometer. What followed was 3 weeks that Willa would later think of not as a trial but as an education, and not the kind you choose. She woke every hour through the night with the uneasy, unshakable sense that something needed checking. So she checked. She adjusted the small clay firebox that Halvard had rigged on the second night. She turned eggs in the near dark, working by feel, her hands moving through the sand with the careful repetition of someone disarming something. She had gotten fast at it. The first few days, anxiety made it take 40 minutes to turn all 218. By the end of the first week, she could do it in 22. She knew because she had started counting. Halvard came every morning before dawn, carrying real coffee, not the chicory substitute she had been making, in 2 tin cups. He would crouch over the sand bed and do his own quiet inspection, moving 2 or 3 eggs with the unhurried certainty of someone who has been doing this long enough that his hands know things his mind does not bother to name. Then he would pour the coffee and sit on the floor beside her, and they would drink in a silence that had become, without either of them deciding this, companionable rather than uncomfortable. He did not talk much about himself, but sometimes in the early mornings, while the blackbirds started up outside and the light changed slowly through the newly patched roof, he would say something about his wife. She had come from Norway with him. She had not spoken English for the first 2 years and had learned it by arguing with the men at the feed store. She had not been afraid of much, only of drought. She had grown up in a place where the rains failed twice before she was 12 years old, and she had never stopped carrying that knowledge in her body, even in years when the Oregon summer was mild and the creek ran clear. Willa would listen and not ask questions she had not earned the right to ask yet. She noticed that Halvard spoke of his wife in a way that told her the woman had been gone for some years. He had the particular, careful quality of someone who has reorganized their life around an absence, who has learned where all the weight has shifted and adjusted accordingly. She did not say anything about the sky, which had been pale and dry for 3 weeks running, or about what Merritt Coble had mentioned when she went in for supplies, that the well at the Thatch Ranch was dropping faster than it should for April. She did not say it. But it was in the room with them, the way things are when neither person wants to be the one to name them first. On the 21st day, one of the eggs moved. She almost missed it. She was doing the midday turn, working her way methodically through the sand bed, when her fingers registered something that her brain took a full second to process. The egg she had just touched had moved on its own. Not much, barely a tremor. But she had been handling these eggs 3 times a day for 3 weeks, and she knew their weight and stillness the way you know the breathing of someone sleeping beside you. And this egg had moved. She put both hands flat on the sand and waited. Another one rocked, then a third. Willa sat back on her heels and pressed her hands over her mouth and did not make a sound, because she was afraid that if she made a sound she would cry, and if she started crying, she did not know when she would stop, and there was too much to do. She stood up and ran to get Halvard. She found him in his upper field mending fence and said without preamble, "They are moving." He looked at her. He dropped the fence tool. He came. They sat together in the shed through the rest of that afternoon, barely talking, watching. More eggs rocked. Then at dusk, they heard the first sound. A faint, persistent tapping from inside a shell, like something knocking on a very small door. Pipping, Halvard said quietly. That is pipping. They are working on the membrane. He told her it could take hours, sometimes more than a day. That she could not help them. That if she broke the shell for them, they would not be strong enough to survive. They had to do it themselves. She understood that completely. She sat and listened to the small, determined tapping, and she did not touch anything. The first gosling broke through at 2 in the morning. Willa was awake, of course. She had been awake since midnight, sitting cross-legged on her bedroll with the lantern turned low, watching the shell she had identified by sound as the most advanced. The crack appeared as a jagged line around the blunt end, then a small piece of shell lifted, and then there was a beak, gray and wet and not particularly beautiful. It was the best thing she had ever seen. She sat on the floor of her tilted shed and watched a gosling dry itself and wobble and fall over and get up again. And she thought about the freight driver's face. She thought about the buyer in Millhaven who had looked at cracked shells and seen only the cracks. She did not write any of this down. She just sat with it. By morning, she had 19 goslings. The hatching stretched over 4 days. She lost 31 eggs total before the process was done, and she found that the preparation she had done for loss had not done much when she actually held a shell that had gone silent and set it aside and kept working. The ones that surprised her were harder than the ones she had been watching with uneasy attention since the first night, but 187 goslings survived. She counted them 3 times because the number seemed wrong, too large, too improbable. She went and got Halvard and made him count them independently, and he came up with 192, and they argued about it in a low, focused way for 10 minutes until they discovered she had missed 7 who had crowded together in the far corner under a piece of wool blanket and were invisible unless you lifted it. Halvard looked at the shed full of small, damp birds already making noise somewhere between a peep and a honk and escalating. For a professional hatchery with equipment, he said, 85% from intact eggs is excellent. He paused. You started with cracked eggs from a ditch. Is that good? She asked again. He looked at her. Willa, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. Yes, that is very good. She went outside. She stood in the morning air for 3 minutes and breathed and looked out over her marsh, her basin, her 10 acres of wet, unloved, unwanted ground. All right, she said. All right then. Then she went back inside to start building a brooder, because 187 goslings needed more space than one tilted shed, and there was work to do. The goslings were not small anymore. By the time May turned toward June, they had doubled in size twice over, and the shed that had held them through the cold nights of April was a memory they had outgrown without ceremony. The brooder Willa and Halvard had built over 2 days in early May stood on the north side of the basin, 3-sided, open to the south, with a covered section for warmth at night, and the birds had claimed it the way they claimed everything, with noise and conviction, and the particular territorial confidence of creatures who have decided that wherever they are standing is exactly where they should be. 3 of them had developed a habit that Halvard found hilarious and Willa found baffling. Every morning, without exception, they positioned themselves at the edge of the basin and honked at their own reflections in the water with the focused intensity of a grudge. They have been doing that for a week, she said one afternoon, watching from the fence. They think it is another goose, Halvard said. You would think they would figure it out. He looked at his coffee cup with the expression of a man who has spent decades observing geese and has stopped expecting them to arrive at reasonable conclusions about anything. The flock was working the wet ground along the basin margins with the same blunt efficiency Willa had first seen in Halvard's birds the previous month. They moved in loose formations through the sedge, cropping it flat, stirring up insects from the soft soil, leaving the ground changed behind them in ways that were slow and cumulative and real. The basin held its water. The sedge grew back faster than they could eat it down. The land that everyone had called a liability was producing something, not crops, not cattle, but a living system that fed itself and grew. Willa stood at the fence some mornings and felt the shape of something she had only sensed before. The wet ground that could not grow corn and could not support cattle could sustain water pasture. Water pasture that could not feed cattle could feed geese. Geese that nobody in Caldwell Flats raised were not in competition with anything anyone else was doing. She was occupying a gap. She was filling a space that everyone had agreed was empty because they had not looked at it from the right direction. She had started to believe that she might actually make it. That was when the valley began to die around her. It happened the way droughts happen in places that do not believe in them. Slowly at first, and then with a speed that left people standing in their fields, looking at cracked earth and wondering when they had stopped paying attention. 7 weeks without real rain. The creek that ran along the north edge of Halvard's property had dropped to a third of its spring flow. The well at the Thatch Ranch, which Merritt Coble had mentioned in passing back in April, had kept dropping and was now the subject of conversations that stopped when Willa walked into the feed store. Walt Holt, whose family had run cattle in the eastern part of the valley for 20 years, was down to 40 head from 220. He had sold 80 in May, sold 80 more in the first week of June, and was watching the remaining 40 with the expression of a man calculating how long he can hold before the decision is made for him. The Pendleton family had sold their entire herd 2 weeks earlier. Barker's cornfields had cracked so badly the roots had simply pulled free of the ground and the stalks had died standing up, which was somehow worse to look at than if they had fallen. Willa's basin was still full. The low ground of the sink, the ground everyone had called worthless, sat at the bottom of a natural bowl and caught every drop that came off the surrounding land. It held water the way old things hold what they have learned, quietly and without drama, simply refusing to let go. While the rest of the valley dried out and cracked and failed, the 10 acres of Mercer ground stayed wet, stayed green, stayed alive. People had started to notice. She knew it before Merritt Coble said it to her face because she had started to see the way men looked at her flock when they drove past on the South Road. Not with contempt anymore, with something more complicated and harder to name. Coble said it on a Wednesday morning in early June when she came in for salt. He put his hands on the counter and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. "We have not had real rain in 7 weeks," he said. "The creek is running at a quarter of what it should be. Walt Holt sold his last cattle 2 weeks ago. Pendleton's pasture is dust." She set the salt on the counter and waited. He said, "People are starting to notice that your land is the only green thing for 2 miles. My birds are 4 months from market weight," she said. "I know that." She paid for the salt and left. She walked back to the sink in the early morning heat and stood at the basin edge and watched her flock working the wet margins of her land, and she thought about Halvard's wife, who had been afraid of drought. She thought about what it meant that the one thing she had, the thing everyone had told her was a liability, was now the one thing the valley did not have enough of. She needed more time. She just needed to get her birds to wait before everything else fell apart around her. She went inside and started planning. Prentice Thatch came to her fence on a Thursday afternoon. She saw him coming from a distance, riding the same gray horse she had memorized in April, moving with the unhurried certainty of a man who has never needed to hurry because the world has always arranged itself to wait for him. He pulled up at her south boundary fence and sat there looking at her flock with an expression she recognized immediately. It was the same expression she had seen on the attorney who handed her the deed, the expression of someone translating everything visible into a number. She walked to the fence without hurrying. He looked down at her from the saddle with something that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. He had been in Caldwell Flats long enough that looking down at people from horseback had become a posture he no longer noticed. "Miss Mercer," he said, "I have heard about your birds." She said nothing. He named a figure. He wanted water access for his remaining cattle, an open arrangement, no time limit, no conditions, use of the basin as needed through the summer. The number was not enough, but more than that, the terms were wrong in a way that went beyond the money. An open arrangement meant his cattle on her land, his cattle at her water, his cattle churning the wet margins that her flock needed. He was not offering her a partnership. He was offering her the privilege of subsidizing his recovery. "No," she said. Thatch shifted in the saddle. He was not a man who heard that word often, and she could see the small recalibration happening behind his eyes, the adjustment from surprise to something cooler and more considered. He said things about neighbors and obligation and what people remember when the hard times are over. He said the word community with the particular emphasis of a man who has never needed the community and is now invoking it as a tool. He called her decision short-sighted. He came close without quite arriving there to calling her selfish. She waited for him to finish. Then she said, in April you told your friend that I would not last until June. I heard you, Mr. Thatch. I was 10 feet away. She paused. It is June now. The silence that followed had texture to it. Thatch looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not fully read, and then he turned his horse and rode back toward the main road without another word. She watched him go and thought, that man will not forget this morning. He was not the most dangerous thing she faced in this valley, but he was the loudest, and in a small place, loud matters more than people admit. She went inside and wrote his name in her notebook under a column she had started labeling watch. It was 11 days later that Jasper Hadley appeared at her fence. She saw him on a Thursday afternoon when she was checking the water level at the basin edge. He was standing at the south boundary fence, looking at her geese, and he had been there long enough that his horse had dropped its head to graze. She had not heard him arrive. He was perhaps 50, heavyset without being soft, with the kind of tan that comes from time spent outdoors in a supervisory capacity rather than a working one. His boots were expensive. Everything about him suggested a man for whom the difference between wanting something and having it was usually just a question of timing. He was not looking at the geese the way the men at the feed store looked at them. He was not even looking at them the way Thatch had. He was looking at them the way a man looks at a line item in a ledger he is already drafting. She walked to the fence without hurrying. "This is private property," she said. He looked at her with the mild surprise of someone not accustomed to being spoken to that way by someone who looked like her. Then he rearranged his face into something agreeable and extended a hand over the fence. "Jasper Hadley," he said, "I have interests in the Millhaven Livestock Exchange and several ranching operations in the Southern Valley. I have been hearing about your flock." She did not take his hand. "Mercer," she said, "this is private property, Mr. Hadley. You are welcome to come back when you have an appointment." Something behind his agreeable expression recalibrated. He was not a man who heard the word appointment from women on failed land. "Of course," he said pleasantly, "I will do that." He walked to his horse without urgency. He did not look back. She stood at the fence and watched him ride toward the Caldwell Flats Road and felt a cold she had not felt before, a specific chill that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with recognizing a kind of attention she did not yet fully understand, but knew enough to take seriously. She went inside and wrote the date, June 24th, and under it, one word: Hadley. She told Halvard that evening. He listened without interrupting, which was how he listened to everything that mattered. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, mending something at his work table, not looking up. "What he says he has," Halvard said finally, "and what he actually has are not the same thing." He paused. He bought the Kellerman property 3 years ago. The family needed cash. The land looked poor. He paid them below value. 2 months later, he sold the mineral rights for 4 times what he paid for the entire parcel. Does he do that often? Often enough that people in the Southern Valley know to be careful. Halvard set down what he was working on. He is not a violent man. He is a patient one. He looked at her. "Those are sometimes harder to deal with." She thought about that. "I am not selling. I know you are not." He picked up his work again. "But he does not know that yet, and how you tell him matters." He told her to listen when Hadley came back with his offer. All the way through, without interrupting, without reacting, just listening. Because people like Hadley have a speech prepared, and the speech is designed to make you feel either flattered or pressured before you have time to think. If you let him finish, you see the shape of it, and you know where the pressure points are. And then you say no, Halvard said, without explaining yourself, because explanations are invitations to argue. Hadley returned 11 days later with an appointment, delivered through Norma Tully at the post office on heavy cream stationery. Norma handed Willa the envelope with an expression that was working very hard at being neutral and not quite succeeding. Willa wrote back and told him 2 on Saturday. She prepared real coffee for the occasion, trading 2 dozen eggs with Norma for a 1/4 pound of ground beans because she wanted to be the person in the room who was ready, and small things signal readiness to people who are paying attention. She left her notebook open on the table to a page of feeding calculations. She arranged the space to say, without saying it, that she was a person who kept numbers and did not need saving. Hadley arrived at exactly 2 o'clock, which told her something. Punctuality in men like him was a form of control, a way of ensuring the person who invited you is always slightly less prepared than they meant to be at the exact moment the knock comes. She had been ready since 1:30. He took in the shed with one slow sweep of his eyes, the tilted floor, the sawbuck table, the wooden box in the corner, the open notebook. He did not comment on any of it, which told her he was disciplined. He sat across from her, accepted the coffee, and said, "Miss Mercer, I want to be direct with you because I think you are a direct person." She said nothing. She let him go. He laid it out with the practiced clarity of someone who has given this particular speech before with variations. She had a flock of birds approaching 200 head. She had them on land that stayed wet because of the natural collection basin. That basin was currently the only reliable water source within 3 miles, because they were 7 weeks in the driest summer this valley had seen in 20 years. Her birds would reach market weight in September or October. At that point, she would have the only significant protein supply in a region where cattle operations had been devastated. The question was not whether her flock was valuable. The question was whether she had the infrastructure to convert that value into income before it evaporated. She noted the word evaporated. She noted the way he said it with the casual specificity of a man who knows exactly what he means. His proposal was a purchase agreement. He would buy the flock at a price reflecting current market conditions, handle transport and sale through the Millhaven Exchange, and take a processing fee of 30%. He named the number. She did the arithmetic in 4 seconds. It was good. Better than she had expected him to open with, which meant either he was being genuinely generous or he expected her to counter, and the real number was higher. She thought about the letter from Reed Klein in Pennsylvania, which she had received the previous week in response to a question about fair market pricing during drought conditions. Price goes up when supply goes down, Klein had written in his compressed, almost coded style. Question is what you do with it. Some sell high and make enemies, some sell fair and make neighbors. Choose carefully. You only get to choose once. She thought about what Halvard had said about the Kellerman family. "Thank you," she said. "I will think about it." He blinked. One small fractional hesitation, the first unguarded thing he had done since he sat down. He had not expected that answer. He had expected yes or a counteroffer. "I will think about it" gave him nothing to work with. "Of course," he said pleasantly. "I understand you will want time." "I will be in touch," she said, and stood up. He stood. He shook her hand this time, and she took it, because refusing twice would tell him something she did not want him to know yet. His hand was dry and firm and entirely confident, and when he smiled at her on the way out, it was the smile of a man who considered this a delay rather than a refusal. She watched him ride away and then went straight to Halvard's property. "The offer is not bad," she said. "His version of not bad." "No," Halvard agreed, "but it is his number. Not yours. There is a difference." He was working at his harness rack, not looking at her. "Did he talk about the basin?" She stopped. "He mentioned that the basin was the only reliable water source within 3 miles. She paused. He did not ask about the drainage. He did not ask about water rights. Halvard set the harness piece down. "The water rights on that basin," he said slowly, "are attached to your deed, not to the land around it, just to the basin itself." She understood where he was going. "On the eastern side of your property," he continued, "between your land and the old Greer pasture, there is a strip of ground roughly 400 feet wide, county land, no improvements, no owner." He paused. "6 weeks ago, someone bought it." The air in the room changed. "Who?" she said, though she already felt the answer forming. "I do not know the name on the deed," Halvard said carefully. "I heard it from Merritt Coble, who heard it from the county clerk. The person who bought it is not local. They paid cash. And that strip of land has no value at all except for one thing. It controls access to the eastern drainage channel." Willa said, "If someone dammed that channel, or redirected it," Halvard said, "your basin would begin to drop, slowly at first, not noticeably for weeks." She stood completely still. The basin level, dropping half an inch since June 24th, the day Hadley had first appeared at her fence. She had assumed it was the drought. She had been watching the sky and blaming the sky. "He was here before he came to see me," she said. "He bought the land before he made the offer." "I do not know that," Halvard said carefully. "I am telling you what I know and what is possible." "But it is possible." "It is possible," he agreed. She sat down on the overturned bucket that was the only other seating in Halvard's barn and put her hands flat on her knees and breathed. She thought about the word evaporated. She thought about the way he had looked at the basin with that casual sideways glance, checking the water level the way you check a clock you already know the time on. "What do I do?" she said. It was the first time she had asked Halvard that directly, without wrapping it in a question about geese or feed schedules or temperatures. Just, What do I do? He was quiet for a long moment. Go to the county office in Harmer, he said. Look at the deed records. Find out who bought that strip. And then, and then you do not react. You keep your birds alive. You keep your basin full as long as you can, and you do not let him know you know. Why not? Because a man who thinks he is ahead will be patient. A man who knows he has been caught will move faster than you can respond. He picked up his needle and the harness piece. You have 4 months until your birds reach weight. He needs you to sell before then. Time is on your side, but only if he does not know you figured that out. She drove to Harmer on Monday morning and told no one where she was going. The county deed office was 14 miles east of Caldwell Flats, in a low brick building on the main street of a town twice the size of Caldwell. The clerk was a young man who was clearly bored and equally clearly not supposed to share information, and she asked her questions with the unhurried manner of someone who has all day and no particular agenda. She found it in 40 minutes. The strip of land east of her property, county parcel number 7, had transferred ownership on June 19, 5 days before Hadley appeared at her fence for the first time. The name on the deed was Preston Holt. The address of record was a post office box in Millhaven, where Hadley kept his livestock exchange. She wrote the name down. She thanked the clerk and went back to the cart. She did not go to Hadley. She did not write him a letter. She did not react. She went home and she was very calm, and she started making a different kind of plan. July arrived without rain. The basin was down 2 inches from its June 24th level. She measured it every morning with a marked stick pushed into the mud at the same spot, and the drop was slow and consistent. Not the sudden loss of a channel fully diverted, but the gradual bleeding of something being reduced at its source. She could not prove it. She did not have access to the eastern drainage to verify what was happening on the Preston Holt parcel, and she was not going to set foot on land that was not hers and give Hadley or Holt any basis to claim she had been trespassing. She ran the numbers. At the current rate, she had approximately 9 weeks before the basin dropped below the level where her birds would lose reliable access to water pasture. Her flock would reach full market weight in 11 to 12 weeks. The margin was narrow enough to make her stomach hurt every time she looked at the measuring stick. She was sitting with this problem on a Tuesday morning when Merritt Coble drove his wagon to her fence and climbed down with the careful movements of a man who has been on the road a while. He took off his hat when he reached the fence. He told her that Walt Holt was his wife's cousin, that Walt had a daughter of 19 and a son of 16 and a wife who had been sick since February, that Walt had sold his last cattle 2 weeks ago, and that the family had some dry goods and a root cellar, but that it was going to be a hard fall if the rains did not come. She waited. I was wondering, Coble said, and the way he said it carried the specific weight of a man for whom asking is genuinely hard, if you might be willing to sell a few birds at a price the family could manage. 6, maybe 8. She looked at him. This was the same man who had stood on the other side of the attorney's wall in March and said that her inheritance was an apology. He did not know she had heard it. It did not matter. I will sell you 10, she said, at cost of feed, not market price. That is what I can do right now, but I need something in return. Name it, he said. I need help building a secondary water storage on the north edge of my property, a clay-lined catch basin roughly 20 feet across. Before August, I need people who know how to work dirt. He thought about it with the arithmetic of a man who's determining whether something is fair. I can get you 3 men who owe me a favor, he said, Walt Holt included. He knows earth moving. Then we have a deal, she said. He started to say something, stopped, then said it anyway. Miss Mercer, I owe you an apology. When you took this land, I was not kind about it. I said things I should not have said. He looked at the fence post. It has amounted to something, she said. Let us go from there. He nodded. He got back on the wagon. She watched him go and thought about what it looked like when a person decides to adjust. Not dramatic, not a speech, just a man turning his hat in his hands and saying what he should have said earlier and accepting that there is work to do. The men came the following Saturday. Walt Holt and his son Ford, 16 years old and still growing into his height, Merritt Coble himself, a quiet man named Aldous who had surveying experience and carried a level in his coat pocket out of habit, and an older rancher called Gruff who did not say a word all day and did twice what anyone else did in a morning. They started at 6 and worked through the hottest part of the day. Willa worked alongside them. She carried clay and tamped lining and did not go inside when it got hot because she was not the kind of person who went inside when it got hot. Ford worked near her for most of the afternoon. He was not the kind of 16-year-old who performs helpfulness. He simply worked, steadily and without commentary, with the focused efficiency of someone who has been taught that effort is not something you talk about. They were both resting against the north fence late in the afternoon, passing a water ladle between them, when he said without preamble, "How did you get those birds from eggs you found in a ditch?" She looked at him. He was not asking to be polite. "I found someone who had already done it," she said, "and I listened to him. That is the whole method. Most things that look impossible are not, if you can find someone who has already done them." He turned that over for a moment. Then he said, "My father told me you are selling us birds cheap." "Your father needed something, and I needed something," she said. "This was the way to get both things done." She paused. "That is usually how it works, if people can set aside pride long enough to have the conversation." Ford nodded slowly. The look on his face was not simple agreement. It was the look of a person filing something away in a place they intend to find again. By evening, the secondary catch basin was roughed in, not finished, not waterproofed yet, but the shape of it was there. It would hold water. When the clay dried and they came back to finish the lining, it would hold a lot of water. She fed everyone from her own stores that evening, biscuits and dried beans and coffee, and they ate standing at the fence in the cooling air and talked the ordinary talk of people who have done physical work together, which is comfortable in a specific way that no other kind of conversation is. Willa looked at the men at her fence, Walt Holt with his careful, tired face and his son, Merritt Coble, who had driven 14 miles each way to offer an apology with his hands, Aldous, who had brought his own level without being asked, Gruff, who said nothing and did everything. She thought about Hadley in Millhaven, wherever he was, waiting for her to get desperate enough to sell. She thought about the slow drop in her basin and the narrow margin between her birds reaching weight and her water running out. She thought about what Halvard had said about choosing how you say no. She had said no to Hadley by saying, "I will think about it." She had said yes to the valley by selling 10 birds at cost and accepting 3 days of labor in exchange. She was beginning to understand that those were the same decision. Both versions of the same answer to the same question, what do you do with something that everyone else has decided is worthless? You find the people who need it. You make the trade that makes sense. You do not wait for a man from Millhaven to decide the terms. She refilled the biscuit plate and came back outside and found that Halvard had appeared at some point during dinner, carrying a jar of something preserved, and was now crouched in the dirt, drawing a drainage diagram with his finger for Ford, who was watching with his whole body, the way young people do when someone is actually teaching them something. Willa set the plate down and stood at the edge of it and felt for the first time since April something that was close to a kind of steadiness. Not peace, not yet. The basin was still dropping and Hadley was still out there recalculating. But something like its working cousin, the sense of being in the right place, doing the right work, with the right people within reach. It lasted until Monday. Hadley came back that morning when she was alone, arriving at 9 without sending a note this time, and he had brought someone with him. A younger man with a leather satchel and the look of a person who worked in documents rather than fields. She met them at the fence. Hadley smiled, the same practiced, confident warmth. He told her he had revised his offer upward, 15% above the original figure, and the younger man opened the satchel and produced a folded paper. She did not take the paper. "My answer is no, Mr. Hadley," she said. "I am not selling the flock." The smile held, but something behind it shifted. That recalibration she had seen the first time, faster now, less smooth. He looked at her basin. Not directly, not with intention you could name. His gaze moved there with a casualness that was not casual at all, and she understood that he was checking the water level, measuring the drop against whatever schedule he had set in his own mind. "The drought is going to get worse before it gets better," he said, as though he were discussing the weather. "I would hate to see you lose birds to dehydration in August when there was a fair offer on the table in July." She looked at him directly. "Is that a prediction or a plan, Mr. Hadley?" The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, she watched his face with the attention she had developed for reading fine details. And what she saw was a man who had just been told, without being told in so many words, that she knew. Not everything. Not the deed in Preston Holt's name or the post office box in Millhaven. But enough. She knew enough, and he could see that she knew, and the speech he had prepared did not have a section for this particular moment. "Good day, Miss Mercer," he said. He turned and walked back to his horse, and the younger man with the satchel followed him, and they rode away toward the Caldwell Flats Road without looking back. She stood at the fence with her hands in her pockets and watched them go, and she was shaking, which she had not expected. Not fear exactly, more the physical aftermath of holding yourself completely still and completely in control for 4 minutes that felt like 40. She went inside and sat down on the tilted floor. Then she got up because there was always something to do, and she went to check the measuring stick, and the water had dropped another quarter-inch since Friday, and she wrote it in her notebook and went to feed the flock, and the flock was loud and opinionated and entirely unconcerned with Jasper Hadley, and that, more than anything else, helped her think clearly. She had not sold. She had not panicked. She had let him see that she knew without telling him what she knew, and now he would have to decide what to do with that, and whatever he decided next would tell her something about how much time she still had. She had a narrow margin and a dropping water table and a secondary catch basin that was not finished yet, and 187 geese who needed 10 more weeks to reach weight. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. It was not from Hadley. It was from the Caldwell Township Water and Land Commission, written on official stationery in the careful impersonal language of bureaucracy, and it informed Miss Willa Mercer that a formal complaint had been filed challenging the private designation of the water basin located on her property on the grounds that said basin constituted a naturally occurring public water source and therefore could not be exclusively controlled by a private landowner during a declared drought emergency. A hearing had been scheduled for August 14th, 3 weeks away. She read it twice at her kitchen table. She set it down and looked at it from a slight distance, the way you look at something you want to see clearly without your own reaction getting in the way. Then she picked it up and walked to Halvard's property. He read it once, slowly, and handed it back. "Preston Holt," he said. "His name is not on it," she said. "The complaint is anonymous." "Anonymous complaints to public commissions do not happen without someone who knows the process," Halvard said. "Someone who has used it before." He picked up what he had been working on, a cracked fence brace he had been soaking in water to swell the wood back together. Hadley used the Water Commission 3 years ago in the Southern Valley. He filed a public access claim on a private well sitting on land he wanted. The family sold before the hearing. Willa felt the particular cold of a plan becoming fully visible all at once. The land purchase, the drainage restriction, the offers, each one higher, and now a legal mechanism that required no direct threat, cost him nothing, and needed only to create enough uncertainty that selling would start to look like relief. "He has been planning this since before he came to see me the first time," she said. "Probably before he bought the strip of land," Halvard agreed. She sat down on the overturned bucket in his barn. "What does the hearing actually mean?" she said. "If they rule against me, can they take the basin?" "They cannot take what you own," Halvard said carefully, "but they can rule that you cannot restrict access to it. If the basin is declared a public water source, anyone can use it. Hadley can bring cattle onto your land. Your flock loses its pasture. Your land gets churned to mud, and your birds are finished. He does not need to take the basin," she said. "He just needs to make it unusable for you," Halvard agreed. Then he paused. "I need a lawyer," she said. "Yes, I do not have money for a lawyer." "No," he agreed, "but you have something a lawyer might want." The man who practiced law in Harmer was named Silas Wells, and he was not what Willa had expected. She had expected someone cautious, someone who would weigh his words against the risk of being wrong. What she found was a short, precise man in his early 60s who wore his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead even when he was not reading, who listened to her entire account without moving his pen or shifting in his chair, and who looked at the drainage diagram she had drawn from her own observations with the stillness of someone who has just been handed confirmation of something he already suspected. She told him everything. The deed records in Harmer. The Preston Holt parcel transferred 5 days before Hadley's first visit. The documented basin drop since June 24th. The offers that escalated in lockstep with the worsening drought. And finally, the letter from the commission. She showed him the dates in her notebook without editorializing, because she wanted him to see the shape of it himself rather than receive her interpretation of it. He saw it. She could tell by the way his jaw tightened slightly at the date of the land purchase, held for a moment, and then released as he moved on to the commission letter. "This provision," he said, tapping the letter, "was written for genuine public necessity. Springs, rivers, shared wells serving multiple families. It was not written for private basins on private land where the owner has made documented investment improvements. He looked up, but it has been used for exactly this purpose before. The Commission lacks the institutional sophistication to distinguish between cases, and they default to access over restriction when they feel political pressure from above. Is there political pressure here? Anyone with business connections in the Millhaven Exchange has political connections in this county, Wells said, with the flat matter-of-factness of someone stating geography. The question is not whether Hadley has influence with the Commission. He probably does. The question is whether the legal record is clear enough that influence alone cannot override it. He looked at her diagram again. She told him she had never set foot on the Preston Holt parcel. Every observation had been made from her own property line or from the public road. He studied the dates she had recorded beside each measurement. This shows a reduction in channel flow beginning approximately the last week of June, he said. Consistent with the date the Holt parcel transferred, she said. He looked at her over his glasses. You assembled this yourself. I keep careful records, she said. I learned it from managing eggs. A beat of silence, and then he made a sound that was almost a laugh. Miss Mercer, he said, I will represent you at the hearing. He named a fee. It was modest, half of what she had feared, and she named a counteroffer, half the fee in cash, half in birds and water access for his wife's kitchen garden through September. He accepted without negotiating, which told her the water access was worth more than she had calculated, or that something in the situation appealed to him beyond the fee. She suspected both. On the drive back to Caldwell Flats, sitting in the cart beside Halvard while the road unrolled behind them, she said quietly, he is going to need the room to be full, is he not? Not just the arguments. Halvard looked at the road ahead. A good lawyer and a righteous case do not always win a hearing when the other side has pressure on the commission, he said. What wins a hearing is when the commission is more afraid of the room than they are of the man filing the complaint. She understood. I need the room. You need the room, he agreed. She went to the Postfus that afternoon. Norma Tully looked up from behind her counter with the expression she always wore, precise, unreadable eyes that had been watching this town for 40 years and had learned to give nothing away for free. Willa set both hands on the counter. I have a hearing in 3 weeks, she said, August 14th in Harmer, and I think some people in this valley might want to be there. Norma looked at her for a moment. Might they, she said. I am not asking for anything specific, Willa said. I am just telling you about the hearing. She paused. You know what this drought has done to people here. You knew about the Holt family before I did. You knew about the Pendleton children. She met Norma's eyes directly. You probably know things about Jasper Hadley and his connection to the Water and Land Commission that I have not found yet. Something shifted in Norma's expression. Not surprise. Something closer to a decision being finalized. The commission chairman, Norma said carefully, has a brother-in-law who supplies hay to the Millhaven Livestock Exchange. She straightened a stack of envelopes that did not need straightening. That is public information, if anyone thought to look. The kind of thing that might matter at a public hearing, Willa said. If someone brought it up, someone informed, Norma said. Who understood what they were looking at? Willa looked at her. Thank you, Mrs. Tully. I have not done anything yet, Norma said, which was a technically accurate statement that meant the opposite of its words. The 2 weeks before the hearing were the most stretched Willa had ever felt, and she had felt stretched before. She sold 12 more birds in that time, carefully and specifically, to families who needed them and could pay what they could, which in 3 cases was less than cost, and in 1 case was nothing at all. The Barker family had not been on her list, but she had taken the long road past their property one afternoon checking a fence line calculation, and she had seen Mrs. Barker in the yard with the particular stillness of a woman trying not to be seen struggling, and Willa had stopped the cart and gone in and come out an hour later with an agreement to deliver 6 birds on Friday. She wrote it in her ledger as an advance against future settlement, which was a fiction they both understood and both needed. The secondary catch basin was finished. Gruff came back the 2nd week of August without being asked, spent a full day waterproofing the lining with the methodical concentration of someone performing a task they intend to do right the first time, and was gone before she could work out what to offer him. She left a dressed bird at his gate. He left a note on her fence post the next morning. 2 words, good enough. Halvard told her that from Gruff that was extraordinary praise. She went over her evidence with Wells twice, once at his office and once at her kitchen table, where he drank her coffee without commenting on its quality and went through every document with a red pencil and the focused economy of a man preparing to win. He had found through his own research 2 previous cases where entities connected to Hadley had used the drought emergency provision to pressure landowners. Neither case had reached a full hearing. Both families had sold. That means there is no legal record of this tactic being successfully challenged, he said, which is both a problem and an opportunity. If we challenge it cleanly and win, it establishes a record. It makes the tactic harder to use again. He looked at her over his glasses. Which means Hadley has more reason than usual to prevent a clean hearing. What does that mean practically? It means he may try to settle before August 14th, Wells said. He may make you an offer large enough to be difficult to refuse. He paused. Are you ready for that kind of pressure? She thought about a shed with 2 holes in the roof and a floor that sloped toward the wall. She thought about 350 eggs in a ditch. She thought about sitting in the dark at 2 in the morning, listening for the sound of something tapping on the inside of a shell. Yes, she said. The offer came on August 10th, 4 days before the hearing. The younger man with the leather satchel delivered it. Hadley did not come himself this time, which she spent a moment trying to interpret, whether it meant he was confident or rattled and could not decide. The number on the paper was nearly double the original offer. She held the paper for a long time. She was not going to pretend it was easy to say no to that number. It was not easy. It was the hardest thing she had done since she sat in the dirt road in April and decided whether to carry 350 broken eggs to a tilted shed with no plan. She stood in her kitchen and felt the full weight of it, the months of not sleeping well, the narrow margin, the basin still dropping, the absolute knowledge that one bad August could end everything she had built. She felt all of it clearly and without flinching because she had learned that the only way through a difficult thing is to look directly at it. She set the paper down, she picked up her pen, she wrote, "No thank you, Miss W. Mercer," and sent it back with the young man who looked at her the way people look at someone who has said something in a language they do not speak. Then she went behind the shed and was sick, which she told nobody. Then she washed her face and went to feed the flock. August 14th was a Thursday. Willa arrived at Harmer Town Hall 40 minutes early. The room was smaller than she had imagined, a low silinged hall with wooden benches and a raised platform at the front where 3 commission members sat behind a long table. The chairman was a pale, narrow-shouldered man named Roan, who had the look of someone who did not enjoy being looked at directly. The other 2 members she did not know. Wells was already there arranging papers at the respondents' table. He looked up when she came in and gave her one brief nod that meant, "We are ready." The complainant's representative, a Millhaven attorney named Sloan, who wore a suit that cost more than her catch basin, sat at the other table without looking at her. And then the people came in. She had not known exactly who Norma had spoken to or what she had said. She had trusted Norma with the information and trusted that Norma understood what it was for. And then she had let it go and focused on the basin and the flock and the documents and Wells. She had not expected 23 people. They came in ones and twos and filled the benches behind her, and she recognized most of them. Walt Holt, his son Ford, Merritt Coble, Aldous, and Gruff, who sat in the back row and looked at the ceiling with his arms crossed and his jaw set. Mrs. Barker, holding her hat in her lap, watching the commission table, with the expression of someone who has decided to be here regardless of how it feels. 2 ranchers she knew only slightly from the north side of the valley, and Norma Tully herself, sitting in the second row with her hands folded and her face entirely neutral, and her eyes fixed on Chairman Roan in the particular way of a woman who has decided to be impossible to ignore. Halvard came in last, 5 minutes before the hearing started, and sat beside Willa at her table without being invited. Wells looked at him for a moment and then accepted this without comment. Hadley was not there. Sloan opened for the complainant. His argument was polished and constructed almost entirely from abstractions, public necessity, drought emergency provisions, equitable access, with almost no specific reference to anything local or personal. It was a brief designed for a commission that would be looking at paper rather than people. The commission was not only looking at paper, Wells responded. He was not flashy, he was specific. He walked through Willa's deed, the documented improvement history, the basin's recorded water rights, the measurement records she had kept since June. Then he placed the Preston Holt deed transfer on the table, June 19th, 5 days before Hadley's first visit to Willa's property. He said, plainly and without theatrics, that the commission was being asked to declare a private water source public, and that the commission should consider who benefits from that declaration, and why the complaint had been filed anonymously by a party with documented financial interest in acquiring the land to which this water was attached. Roan shifted in his chair. Sloane objected to the characterization. Wells said, the relationship between the anonymous complainant and the purchaser of the Eastern Strip parcel, acquired 5 days before the first purchase offer was made to Miss Mercer, is a public record that the commission is entitled to consider. The room was very quiet. Norma Tully raised her hand, which was technically not permitted in a commission hearing, but Roan, who was looking increasingly like a man who wished he were somewhere else, acknowledged her. I would like to note for the record, Norma said in her precise, careful voice, that the commission chairman's brother-in-law supplies hay to the Millhaven Livestock Exchange, which is the primary business of Mr. Jasper Hadley. She paused. That is also a matter of public record if anyone thought to check. The room did not erupt. It got quieter, if that was possible. The specific quiet of 23 people all deciding at the same moment to pay close attention. Roan's neck had gone red. Sloane objected. Is that relevant, he said. Is it inaccurate? Norma asked. The silence stretched. Walt Holt stood up without asking. He was not a tall man, but he stood like one, with the deliberate steadiness of someone who has decided what he is willing to say in public and intends to say it. I want to say, he told the commission, that Miss Mercer sold my family birds at cost when we had nothing left, and asked for labor in return rather than charity. She has fed people in this valley who were failing. Her land, her water, her flock kept the eastern part of this valley from losing everything this summer. He looked directly at Roan. I do not know what this commission was told about why this hearing needed to happen, but I know what is true about her land and her water and what she has done with them, and I thought someone should say it out loud. He sat down. Aldous stood next, quietly and without announcement, and placed a hand-drawn survey map on the commission table. He had mapped the eastern drainage channel and the Preston Holt parcel from the public road with his own instruments, and the map showed clearly and precisely what a diversion or obstruction at that point would do to the Mercer Basin over an 8-week period. Wells placed Willa's notebook measurements beside the map. The basin has dropped 5.5 inches since the Holt parcel was acquired, he said. The drought accounts for approximately 2 inches of that loss. The remaining 3.5 inches is consistent with a reduction in channel inflow. Sloane objected again. Wells noted the objection for the record. Roan called a recess. Willa sat at her table while the room moved around her. Halvard set a cup of water in front of her from somewhere and did not say anything, which was exactly right. Wells sorted his papers with the composure of a man who has given closing arguments before and knows that what happens in the room after you have spoken is not something you can manage. At the other table, Sloane was writing something quickly on a sheet of paper, and from the angle of his pen and the speed of his hand, Willa could tell it was not notes. It was a letter, she thought. He is writing to Hadley. Hadley did not know the room would look like this. The commission returned after 18 minutes. Roan read from a prepared statement in the flat voice of someone reading words they did not write. The complaint had been found insufficient to meet the statutory standard for drought emergency public access provisions. The basin at parcel 7112 was confirmed as a private water resource with documented improvement investment. The complaint was dismissed. Sloane packed his satchel. He was out the door before the words had fully settled. Wells placed his hand flat on the table between them. Not a dramatic gesture, just a steady palm. That is it, he said quietly. Willa looked at the dismissed complaint on the table. That is it, she said. Behind her, she heard Walt Holt say something low to his son, and Ford say something back that she could not make out. And then someone clapped, one single awkward, genuine clap from somewhere in the back row that might have been Aldous, and then it stopped because this was a commission hearing and not a theater, and the awkwardness of it was somehow better than anything polished would have been. Halvard was already standing. He picked up his hat and put it on and looked at her with those pale, alert eyes. We should get back, he said. The flock needs turning. She laughed. It came out wrong, too sharp, too sudden, the laugh of someone whose body has been holding tension for 3 weeks and has just been told it can stop. She pressed her hand over her mouth. Halvard waited with the patience of a man who has been waiting for things his entire life. She thanked Wells, who accepted it briefly, and said he would send a summary of the proceeding in writing and expected the remaining balance in birds at her earliest convenience. She shook Norma Tully's hand, and Norma squeezed once and said, "The town hall record will note who was in the room today. That matters more than people think." She said a few words to Walt, to Merritt, to Aldous. She nodded to Gruff, who nodded back and did not feel that anything further was required. Then she walked out of Harmer Town Hall into the August afternoon and stood in the heat and breathed. The sky was the same dry white it had been for 9 weeks. The basin would still be 5.5 inches down when she got home. 10 weeks remained until her birds reached full weight. Hadley had lost this round, but men like him did not stop because of one hearing. She knew all of this. She stood in the August heat and knew all of it, and she was still standing. And so was her flock. Halvard came out and stood beside her. "You did well in there," he said. "Wells did well. Walt did well. Aldous did well." "Yes," he agreed. "That is what doing well looks like. You did not do it alone," he paused. "That is also you doing well." The rain came on a Saturday morning in late September, without warning. No clouds building over 3 days, no shift in the wind that people in the valley had learned to read as a sign. Willa woke at 5:30 as she always did, and heard something on the roof that her brain took 3 full seconds to identify because it had been so long. Rain. She lay still and listened to it for a moment, making sure she was actually hearing it, and not doing what desperate people do, hearing what they need to hear in neutral sounds. But it grew louder, and she could smell it, that specific smell of dry ground receiving water that cannot be mistaken for anything else. She got up and opened the door and stood in it. It was not a drizzle. It was real rain, the kind that arrives with intention, drumming on the dry sedge and making rings on the basin surface and running in quick channels along the ground where the earth had cracked so hard it could not absorb fast enough. She stood in it until she was soaked through. Then she went inside and sat on the edge of her bed and put her face in her hands and stayed like that for a while. Not crying exactly. The particular release of a body that has been holding tension for so long it had forgotten what neutral felt like and was now trying to remember. She had made it to the rain, barely, and not alone, with margins she would not want to repeat, but she had made it. The basin was already rising by 6 in the morning. By midday, it had recovered 2 inches. By evening, it had come back 3, and the secondary catch basin that Gruff had waterproofed was filling from the runoff for the first time, doing exactly what it had been built to do. She went to find Halvard, but he was already at his fence looking at the sky. She leaned on the fence beside him. They stood together in the rain without talking for a while, which had become over 6 months one of their most comfortable modes. She would have cried, he said eventually. She glanced at him. He was still looking at the sky. "Your wife," she said. She never got used to it. The rain coming back. He turned his jacket collar up. Even in years when the drought was not severe, when the summer just ran dry for a few weeks the way it does, when the rain came back, she would stand at the kitchen window and cry a little. He paused. "I used to think it was excessive. Now I understand it better." Willa looked at the basin filling with rain she had been waiting for since June. "I almost sold," she said. "The second offer. The number he sent on August 10th. After I said no, I went behind the shed." Halvard was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "How?" "Because I would have been afraid of that number too," he said simply. Anyone who was not afraid of it was not paying attention. He looked at the sky. Being afraid and doing it anyway is not the same as courage in the stories. In the stories, brave people are not afraid. In real life, brave people are afraid, and they do it anyway. And then sometimes afterward they are sick behind the shed. He paused. That is less poetic, but it is more accurate. She laughed in the rain genuinely the first time in weeks. The civil filing was Walt Holt's idea, offered one afternoon in October when Willa laid out the full picture of what she knew about the drainage interference and what Wells had told her was possible. Walt was not a dramatic thinker. He thought about problems the way a rancher thinks about land, not what it should be, but what it actually is and what can be done with it. "Sometimes the right move is not to win," he said. "It is to make the cost of fighting you higher than the value of what he stands to gain." She drove home thinking about that and wrote Wells that evening, "Proceed." She did not hear directly from Hadley again. What she heard through Norma Tully, who heard it through the channels that only Norma maintained, was that the civil filing had reached Hadley's desk in Millhaven and that his reaction had been, Norma's word delivered with her characteristic precision, unpleasant. 2 weeks after that, the Preston Holt parcel was quietly listed for sale. A month after the filing, Hadley's attorney contacted Wells about a settlement. The negotiation took 3 weeks, and Willa was not in the room for any of it, which was correct. Wells was in the room, and Wells was, as Walt Holt had predicted, very specific and very thorough. The number that came back was not enormous, but it was real, enough to cover the cost of the legal action. There was a documented acknowledgement of the drainage interference, and there was a covenant attached to the Preston Holt parcel deed restricting any future modification of the Eastern Channel, a restriction that ran with the land regardless of who owned it. She signed the settlement on a Tuesday morning in Wells's office. He pointed at the covenant and said, "That is the most valuable part of this document. It stays on that land forever." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You are not entirely satisfied," she considered. "I am satisfied," she said. "I just wanted him to have to say it out loud in a room in front of people who knew him." "That is not a legal concept," Wells said. "No," she agreed. "It is a human one." He gathered the papers. The hearing record in Harmer has his name attached to the complaint indirectly. People who look will see it. She thought about Norma Tully, who had spent 40 years ensuring that relevant information reached the people who needed it. "People in this valley look," she said. She drove home through a valley that was different in October. Cooler, the sky back to its proper depth of blue after months of that drained white, the grass beginning to recover along the creek lines where the water had returned. Things were not restored. One good rain does not undo a summer like that one. But there was a quality to the light that was different from August, something she could only describe as trying, which was not nothing. Prentice Thatch had sold his remaining 40 head in September and left the valley quietly without announcement. The land he had farmed was taken over by a nephew from the eastern part of the state, a younger man who had no memory of April and no stake in whatever had been said on a road in spring. Willa noted this without satisfaction and without regret. It was simply what happened when the math ran out. 162 birds reached full market weight through September and October, and Willa sold them not through any exchange or middleman connected to Hadley, but through a network of direct arrangements she had built without planning to build it. Through 6 months of fair trades and honest dealings, the Holt family took 12. The Barkers settled their advance. 3 families from the north side of the valley who she had met at the hearing placed orders, and she filled them at prices that were fair to everyone and good for her. The restaurant in Harmer had heard about the flock through someone who had been in the room on August 14th, and that arrangement alone covered the settlement costs and the grain debt she still owed Halvard. She paid Halvard on a Wednesday morning in late October, arriving at his barn with a ledger notation in cash, the full amount plus interest she had calculated herself, which he had not asked for. He looked at the money and then at her. "I said grain for geese," he said. "Grain for geese and interest," she said. "You lent when I had nothing. That is worth more than the face value. Keep the interest," he said, more firmly. "Put it toward the second breeding season. I do not need the money. I needed you to succeed." Those are not the same thing. She looked at this man, the one who had appeared at her fence line on an April morning with a wooden box full of beeswax and warm sand and extra blankets, who had sat on a dirt floor with her at 2 in the morning listening for something tapping on the inside of a shell, who had told her how to say no and how to walk into a hearing room and how to stand in the rain. "Thank you," she said. It came out more quietly than she intended and with more weight than 2 words usually carry, and they both understood what it covered. He picked up his coffee cup. "Sit down," he said. "I made real coffee." She sat down. Ford Holt came to her one morning in early November and stood at the edge of the basin waiting for her to come outside, which was different from how he usually arrived. "I wanted to ask you something," he said when she came out. He laid it out simply. His father was going to try again in the spring, a small starter herd when cattle prices came down. But there would be a gap. She would not have income until the following fall at the earliest. He had been coming twice a week for months and doing the work before she was awake sometimes. He wanted to ask if there was a regular position here. "What does your father think?" she said. "He thinks I should ask." "What do you think you should be paid?" she said. He named a number. She could see he had set it low because he was afraid of hearing no, and she recognized that calculation because she had made it with Wells. She named a different number, higher. He blinked. "That is more than I asked." "I know what this work is worth," she said. "I do not pay below that." He adjusted to this version of the conversation, the one where someone gave you more than you asked for without requiring you to earn it through negotiation. "All right," he said. Then after a moment, he looked at her with the particular directness of a 16-year-old who has decided to say the thing he actually wants to say. You do not know my name. I know your last name is Holt, she said. I have been calling you the Holt boy in my head for 6 months. He stared at her for a moment and then laughed, surprised out of him. Ford, he said. Ford Holt. Ford, she said. Come inside. I will show you the breeding records. November moved into December, and the valley did what valleys do after a drought breaks, recovering unevenly and without glamour, some things coming back faster than others, and some things not coming back at all. The Kellerman family, the ones Halvard had mentioned years earlier, who had sold their land to Hadley at a low price, did not return. Some losses are structural. Some gaps in a community take the shape of people who left and did not come back, and the people who remain adjust around those shapes without ever quite filling them. Roan chose not to seek reappointment to the commission in January, quietly, without announcement. Norma Tully mentioned it the next time Willa came to the post office. Is that enough? Willa asked. Norma considered the question with genuine seriousness. No, she said. But it is more than there was before, and more than there was before is what most real changes actually look like. The people who wait for everything to be fully fixed usually miss the part where it gets slightly better, which is the part they could have helped with. She went back to sorting envelopes with the air of someone who has said exactly what she meant to say. The second breeding season began in February. 25 birds, an expanded brooder, the secondary basin performing as designed through the winter, and a written operations manual that Ford had helped her assemble from her scattered notebooks over a series of evenings at the kitchen table in December. He had looked at her records and immediately understood that they needed to be organized differently. And he had done it with her in the quiet, particular way of someone who thinks in systems without having been taught to. She had standing sale agreements in place for the fall, the Harmer restaurant, a buyer from the next county, and Merritt Coble, who had decided to sell dressed birds alongside his feed supplies and had asked if she could provide a steady source. She had told him yes, and then gone home and done the arithmetic to verify it, and the answer was yes, if the second hatch went as well as the first. One evening in the last week of February, Halvard came over as he had taken to doing, arriving without a fixed time, but with the regularity of someone who has found that a neighboring property has become a place where evenings are simply better than staying home alone. He and Ford were talking about the spring water table, Halvard drawing a diagram on the tabletop with his finger, and Ford copying it into his notebook in a cleaner version, and Willa sat across from them with her coffee and watched. The man in his early 70s with the uneven beard and the alert pale eyes. The boy of 17, almost 18 now, with his notebook and his careful handwriting and the 5 geese he had named against her, expressed preference and would never entirely stop doing things like that. She felt something that took her a moment to name. Not happiness exactly, though it was close. Something more durable, the sense of a thing that has become reliable, that she could build it on because it would be there when she came back to it. She had lived most of her life before April without anything that felt that way, without people who were present for reasons that were not purely transactional, even when the transactions between them were real. She did not say any of this out loud, because she was not a person who said things like that out loud, and also because Halvard was explaining something about groundwater recharge rates to Ford using the diagram he had drawn, and Ford was listening with the focused attention of someone who does not want to lose the information. The recharge rate will be higher this year, Halvard was saying. The ground cracked so badly in the drought that the surface area for absorption increased. Your basin will fill faster in spring than it did last year, which means the grass comes in earlier, Ford said, which means the flock goes to pasture earlier. Less supplemental feed in March, you save on cost. Ford wrote it down, then he looked up. How do you know all of this? Halvard picked up his coffee. I have been watching this ground for 22 years, he said, and before that I watched different ground in a different country for 30 more. He drank. You watch something long enough, it starts to tell you things. What was the ground like there? Ford asked. Where you grew up? Halvard was quiet for a moment. Different, he said. Drier, older. He set the cup down. But ground is ground. It wants the same things everywhere. Water and time and someone paying attention. Willa wiped the finger diagram from the table before it dried into the wood. Halvard pretended not to notice. Ford drew a final cleaner version in his notebook for reference. Outside, the flock had settled into their evening sounds, the low conversational murmur of birds who are comfortable where they are. The basin sat at its proper full level, rain restored and holding. The eastern channel ran clear. The covenant on the Preston Holt parcel was filed in Harmer and would be there attached to that land long after she was finished caring about it. She had come to Caldwell Flats with $83 and a deed to 10 acres that the whole town had called worthless. She had looked at it as hard as she could and asked what it actually was, rather than accepting what everyone said it was. That was the whole of it. That was the only secret, if there was one. You look at the thing honestly. You find the person who knows what to do with it and you listen to them. You do the work 3 times a day, even when nothing visible is happening yet. You say no to the offer that is not right, even when your hands are shaking. You make the trade that is fair on both sides. You let people help you, and you help them back, and you keep careful records of both. And you wait, because the eggs do not hatch any faster for your wanting them to, and the rain comes when it comes. And most of what happens to you is the consequence of what you chose to do with your hands and your time and your $83 on the days when you did not know yet whether any of it was going to work. She had not known. She had been wrong about some things and naive about others, and she had been helped at the right moments by people who had their own reasons for helping and whom she had tried to deserve. She was not the hero of a clean story. She was a person who had done mostly the right things and some wrong ones, and had kept going in the direction that felt honest. Alvord was still talking about spring water tables. Ford was still writing. The lamp was warm on the table between them. Willa picked up her notebook and opened it to the breeding records and started to work, and nobody said anything for a while, because nothing needed saying. The land outside was dark and full of water. Spring was 6 weeks away. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And for the first time since April, that felt less like a weight and more like a gift.